Hello everyone, today I'm bringing you the Mannequin of the Month for June 2023, and as it happens we're continuing something of a Canadian theme that's been present on the channel recently. Of course the topic we're going to be talking about was chosen via a poll over on Patreon. The corporal tier over there get a chance to vote each month on what's going to be covered, and what we're covering today is the kit of a Canadian infantryman on exercise in the mid to late 1950s, erring more towards the late 1950s with this set of equipment here. Just a few details sort of lend to that time period. So we'll start at the top as we normally do and run through the kit and the uniform we have on the Mannequin here. Starting at the top we have the steel helmet, and this is still the Mark II steel helmet of Second World War vintage, soon to be replaced with the M1, which would really change the look of the Canadian soldier, but at this point still wearing the Mark II helmet with a helmet net and Hessian used here as scrim to obviously break up the outline of the helmet, provide some camouflage there. The basic uniform consists of the Canadian bush uniform, which had been first introduced in 1949 and was worn through into the 1960s when it began to be replaced by the new combat uniform. So worn on exercise in the late 1950s. Prior to this, you would see overalls worn commonly on exercise, a one-piece boiler suit basically. But by the later 1950s, bush uniforms started to be worn on exercise as well. The logic of wearing the overalls was to save wear and tear on the actual field uniforms, but by the late 1950s that had begun to change. So you see the bush uniform worn on exercise. Obviously in the summer months, in the winter months, battle dress was still the order of the day, but we're looking at the summer here. So we have the bush uniform, sleeves rolled up as you can see here. The removable waist belt of the jacket has been removed, obviously because it's being worn with the combat equipment, and this would be worn with drill trousers, the same material basically, with a double buckle fastening at the waist, ankle boots and puttees generally speaking. The equipment is the Canadian 1951 pattern, which we have talked about in detail on the channel previously, but I'll nevertheless run through the various components we have here. Starting at the top here, you can see the shoulder straps coming around from the haversack carried on the back here. These are very similar to the 1937 pattern, Canadian manufactured L-straps, the later war manufactured Canadian L-straps, and you have those clipped into the top of the two ammunition pouches there, as you can see. These are considerably longer than 1937 pattern, but otherwise quite similar, and the reason for this was Canada, when this equipment was introduced, was not sure, the Canadian Army was not sure exactly what weapons were going to be used in the future, so these were designed to be pretty universal and could take any kind of magazines for the weapons and so forth that were being considered at the time. So we have the two ammunition pouches there and the belt at the waist here, again quite similar to 1937 pattern, but bringing in elements from US design using the eyelets here, as you can see, both for adjustment and to allow for the attachment of equipment using M1910 type hanger hooks, and we'll see some of that as we move this round. So 1951 pattern, basically a modernised and updated version of 1937 pattern in basic form, but with some features, some components which were brand new to the design or brought in from other equipment, adapted from other countries' equipment, and we'll see that as we move this round as well. That's the front of the Mannequin. We'll start moving this round now and have a look at some of the other details. Moving on to look at the right hand side of the Mannequin here, you can see further details of the bush uniform jacket here. You've got the epaulette up on the shoulder there, you can see the rolled sleeve there. There are belt loops on the side of this for wearing the belt, which is designed to go with this, with a two-prong buckle when the equipment is not worn. That's concealed underneath the webbing belt of the equipment there. And round on the hip we have the canteen in its carrier. Now this is basically copied from US practice with some modifications. The carrier is in essence an M1910 type carrier with an M1910 canteen in here. You can see the cap here. It's an aluminium canteen with a cup nested with it, very much in common with US practice. It also attaches to the belt using M1910 type hanger hooks. Obviously this is something we looked at in the video looking at 1951 pattern in some detail, but it also has buckles on the side in common with the skeleton and sleeve type carriers for the enamel water bottle, which had been used during the Second World War. So it can be attached onto the brace ends as we have here, and both methods of attachment are used in this instance. The brace ends have been buckled through here, and it's also been attached to the belt, which means it's very securely held in place. It doesn't bounce around too much and it doesn't sway around too much. It's a very secure way of carrying it on the hip. And obviously if you're not having to take the equipment apart frequently, this is quite a good way of doing things. It means it is carried very securely on the hip there. So it's an aluminium canteen, aluminium cup in a US type carrier that's been modified for Canadian use with these extra features, and that's a step away from the British equipment which had been used up to the introduction of this set of equipment It is an advance on 1937 pattern, and as I say, some elements of design from other armies being brought in there, basically copying US practice with the canteen and carrier. Moving around to look at the back, we have the haversack, which is carried quite high on the back, as you can see here. This again is a modification of the 1937 pattern. Internally it has a similar setup of dividers and so forth inside. The size is very similar, but it has the addition of eyelets on the flap here for carrying entrenching tool on the back when required. And you can see it uses wider buckles for the closure there, just standardizing the fittings across the equipment. So you're always using 1-inch straps and 1-inch buckles. The 1937 pattern had a larger set of different buckles and so forth, and this just standardizes things and eases production somewhat. It's carried on L-straps on the shoulder, as we've already seen, and they adjust and attach in exactly the same way as 1937 pattern. So again, it's another incremental development. One feature as well, of course, is all the blackened fittings and the green finish, the dark green finish, which was not something that was seen with 1937 pattern, requiring Blanco, of course. So that's another advance on 1937 pattern. Underneath, you can see the braces coming down here to support the back of the belt. They buckle onto the belt in the same way as you've seen with 1937 pattern. 2 buckles attached to the back of the belt, which the braces pass down through. Can't see that in this instance because the poncho is being carried rolled up on the back of the belt, as you can see here. And this uses the supporting straps for the pack, which was part of the 1951 pattern, which again is basically a carry across from 1937 pattern, and before that from the 1908 pattern equipment. It's modified again with extra fittings on the outside, but it does still use supporting straps crossing at the back to attach the shoulder straps. They've been detached in this instance. The pack is not being carried, as you can see, so they're being used to carry the poncho rolled up on the back of the belt. And this is very similar to a US poncho, but produced in Canada. As I remember, I think it was the XM51 poncho was the designation off the top of my head. Happy to be corrected on that. These have been attached, or these have been looped around and secured in an unusual manner, which I've seen in photographs. I've seen a particularly clear photograph of this method being used, a studio photo of a member of the Queen's Own Rifles showing the equipment being carried for the field. And what you do is you take the buckle and you run the strap round the belt through the top of the buckle and back round through the belt and then back through the other section of the buckle that way and tuck the end down here. I hope I've explained that clearly enough. It means that you end up with a very neat way of attaching this, where the end of the strap is actually tucked away. You don't end up with any tails sort of flapping around or anything. Quite a neat way of doing things. Whether troops exercising in the field would have bothered with this, it is slightly more complex than just buckling the straps on to carry the poncho. I don't know whether they would have bothered or not, but it is a neat way of doing things and something I wanted to replicate here and just talk about briefly. So slightly unusual way of using the straps there, but it does keep everything nice and neat and out of the way at the back there. Poncho carried here, and then obviously you'd have various items, perhaps the pullover and various other bits and pieces, wash kit and so forth, carried up in the haversack there. Moving on to look at the left-hand side of the Mannequin here, you can see the bayonet for the C1 rifle is carried in a bayonet frog, suspended from the belt there. Canada, of course, had been the first Commonwealth country to introduce a derivative of the FNFAL in the 1950s, and so we have the bayonet for that rifle carried around here. Of course, the earlier frogs were designed for carrying the spike bayonet for the rifle number 4, but we have the later bayonet here for the C1. In front of that we have a mess tin carrier, and you'll notice I didn't mention mess tins as contents for the haversack. We actually have a mess tin pouch as part of the design. This was introduced partly because Canadian troops had made extensive use of extra water bottle carriers with the 1937 pattern for carrying mess tins. This was seen in the latter days of the Second World War and also extensively in Korea as well. And so as part of the 1951 pattern equipment, a specific pouch for carrying the mess tins was introduced. This would persist into future Canadian designs of equipment, but was often used for carrying other things other than the mess tins. But in this instance, we've got the mess tins in there, basically the standard square mess tins you'd see in British and Commonwealth service from the Second World War, the start of the Second World War onwards, obviously introduced alongside the 1937 pattern equipment, designed to fit within the haversack of that equipment. But in this instance, as I say, you have this neat pouch here, the quick release fastener, sized perfectly to take the mess tins, and this attaches in the same way as the canteen carrier. So it has the M1910 hanger hooks on the back attaching it to the belt, and then it also buckles onto the brace ends, as you can see here. and obviously carried down on the hip, as I say. Again, that makes for a very stable way of carrying this. There's not a lot of sort of rocking around and bouncing around. It will bounce around a bit, but it won't sway because it's attached with these 3 different points, the buckles on the side and then the M1910 hanger hooks in the rear. And that's the left-hand side of the Mannequin. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. It's been nice to set this up. I've wanted to get the Canadian 1951 pattern equipment out for a while. This option has actually been available on the poll over on Patreon for quite a few months now. It was finally chosen this month, so it's nice to have been able to put all this together and obviously to talk about it in Mannequin of the Month this month. And it's nice to have this set up on the Mannequin. It'll be gracing the front room for a good few weeks yet until it's time to set up the next one for July's Mannequin of the Month. If you have found it interesting looking at this and you'd like to see more from the channel, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those 2 methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. Obviously, if you want to vote on Mannequin of the Month each month, the corporal tier over on Patreon gives you that option. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, where there will of course be photographs of this posted up as well, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down below as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.